Today's conversation takes us back to 2016, which marked a watershed year for women's leadership. There were two landmark elections, the Secretary-General of the United Nations and the US presidency. Two women were the front runners, but both women lost. We want to understand what happened. In the 70-year-old history of the United Nations, not a single woman has held the role of Secretary-General. But because Irina Bokova ran, generations to come will stand on her shoulders. Because she ran and she lost, she won a trailblazing path for women who will now choose to run for the highest public officers in the world. And because of her, other women will run, and maybe someone who is listening to this conversation will be inspired to run because Irina ran. We all know that Irina Bokova was the first woman to head UNESCO. She was the first woman Director-General of UNESCO. But less known is the fact that she helped to lead Bulgaria's transition to democracy. She helped to write Bulgaria's constitution, and she helped Bulgaria's entrance to the European Union. What I want to do at the very beginning is to look at some of her lived values and how those lived values translated and transformed into some of the most important policies at UNESCO and at the United Nations. First of all, I want to focus on the ways in which she embraced girls' education as the primacy, as the very important pillar of UNESCO's own mission. Her work on women's education can be summed up in her own words when she said, "An educated girl is more dangerous than a drone to fight extremism and to fight fundamentalism." Her own embrace of diversity was seen in the way in which she answered one of the most important questions that was asked of her when she was running for Secretary-General of the United Nations. She was asked, "Why do you want this challenging job? The hardest, highest glass ceiling needs to be cracked, but why do you want it?" And she answered simply, "Because I want to serve the world. And I want to serve the world in its full diversity, in the richness of its diversity." Thirdly, her embrace of multilateralism. As the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Bulgaria, she had the honor of presenting the papers for Bulgaria's accession to the European Union Commission. And she has always said that at that moment, at that powerful moment, she had tears in her eyes because that was Bulgaria's embracing of multilateralism and her own sense of the importance of multilateralism as a unique value to the human condition, to the human race. And finally, the ways in which she embraced our cultural heritage helped to transform the way we think of cultural heritage as important to peace and security. There is a moment in 2015 which is indelibly linked to the UN Security Council Resolution 2347, which she was the architect of. There was a moment in 2015 when a colleague called her out of a meeting to tell her that the Mosul Museum in northern Iraq had fallen into the hands of ISIS. And it was that moment where she said, "The attack on one culture is an attack on our entire collective civilization." And at that moment was born the very first germs of Resolution 2347, which holds that the destruction of heritage is a crime against humanity. So what she did there was to connect the dots and to conceptualize the ways in which the destruction of cultural heritage was an attack of our collective civilization, but also was a threat against humanity, and was a threat against peace and security, and was a crime against humanity. And finally, Irina, you have said that losing is a test of character. Although you lost this hardest, highest race, you showed the world, and especially women, how to lose with grace and dignity. You congratulated the Secretary General Guterres, immediately after his victory. You said what an important candidate he was and what an important Secretary General he would be. But you also offered him your services, and you offered to continue to serve the world. And then most importantly, you also built common cause with your former rival, Helen Clark, the former President of New Zealand, who ran against you for the highest, hardest office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. And it was such an important moment when you sat with her at the launch of the movie on Helen Clark, which chronicled her journey running for the Secretary General of the United Nations. And now together you're working on the upliftment, on the advancement of women around the world. So what I want to do now is to engage you in conversation on the importance of women's leadership. First of all, I'm going to start with this question, Irina. To all the little girls and young women watching, you showed how to run and how to lose. What do you have to say to them that will inspire them to continue the work that you have started?
Well, thank you very much, Rangita. Thank you for this opportunity, conversation to share with you some of my thoughts, some of my experiences, some of my hopes, some of my grievances. I think the cause of multilateralism, the cause of women's empowerment, girls' education, cultural diversity is an extremely important one. And that is why I'm so pleased to be here at UPenn and to share with the students, with girls, with the faculty, some of these experiences. To the little girls, I would say that they have to dream, they have to believe in themselves, they have to believe that they can do anything in this world. And I can say that I have been, during my tenure, 8 years as Director-General of UNESCO, you can imagine how many universities, schools I have visited, and how much I have been engaged, particularly with girls and young women. And I know that they have been always dreaming of becoming medical doctors, of teachers, of lawyers, and very often, they were telling me, we want to become Director-General of UNESCO. And I think this is wonderful. This is wonderful because it means that they consider possible for them to run for such positions. And you mentioned something that I have been very much inspired by Nicholas Kristof, this phrase about the educated girl is more powerful than a drone. And I remember once when I was in Kabul in Afghanistan and I visited a girls' school, and I saw on the walls of the school papers with different phrases, and on one of them it was written, "The pen is my sword." And I think it was so powerful to see such an inscription on the wall. And I know that girls' education, women's education, empowerment, this is probably the most powerful way of changing societies, of bringing prosperity, of social inclusion, of social justice, of economic growth. And that is why I think if we don't do this, we will never achieve what we want to achieve in this world of sustainable peace and justice. But at the same time, we know that with United Nations, I'm speaking about UNESCO, we need to invest in this institution. We need to strengthen this as a global platform of action for this, be it in terms of protection of heritage or in terms of education, because this is how we change minds of people, something that is written in UNESCO's constitution since wars begin in the minds of men. Now we say also of women. It is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed.
Thank you, Irina, for those inspiring words. Ban Ki-moon too once said, "What is it about a girl with a pencil that so frightens a man with a gun?" So on that note, I recall that when you first came to UNESCO, it was a very masculinized space. But when you left it, you had managed to feminize it in very unparalleled ways. You now have, in UNESCO's leadership, over 50% women. And that is an enormous task. And how did you close the gender gap? Tell us, because that is really the cause of our time, closing the gender gap. And you did that at UNESCO.
I think it's important to do what you believe in and what you say. Closing this gap is important because then you change the overall perception and understanding. I do believe that you cannot achieve gender equality if you don't have, and you can't have women leaders if you don't have a broad critical mass of women in important positions. And that is why, for me, when I arrived, it was 24% of women in the director and above level, and now we have 50%. It doesn't come automatic. I think what I did was to look for women, competent women, women that can do the job. And you have to support women. I believe in women supporting women. There are plenty of competent women around. One has to overcome the stereotyping, because I was tired of being asked when you had a women candidates, whether she is a competent or whether she is a strong enough. I think I have always heard these two questions, whether she is competent and strong enough. And I remember when I was appointing a director of our hydrological program, and there were plenty of good candidates, more men, I would say. This still is very much a domain where expertise comes on the men's side. And there was a woman candidate, which I ended up by appointing, but the discussion was around whether she's strong enough. And I think it is very, very important that you show that in not traditional for women, I would say, areas of competence, you appoint a woman. So I'm very proud of what I did. I'm proud that now one of the most important positions are taken by women, and it changes the overall perception of what this organization represents and how you work also with member states.
And what you did was to change the culture at UNESCO, but by doing so, create intergenerational transformation. Because Hillary Clinton's recent book, What Happens, she states in it, historically women have not been the ones writing the laws or leading armies and navies. We are not the ones up behind the podium, rallying the crowd, uniting the country or the world. It's men who speak, it's men who represent us to the world and even to ourselves. She goes on to say, I suspect for many of us, it feels like somehow difficult to picture a woman president sitting in a situation room. But there is this paradox, because you had sat in the situation room. You had written constitutions, you had written laws, you had written important declarations. You were the one behind the podium. But still, when it came to that last defining race, a man spoke on behalf of not just men, but behalf of women. You speak to that moment in your race when someone asks the men who are running for Secretary General, are you a feminist? And they say, we are a feminist. And it's wonderful to have male feminists, but does that mean that they can speak for women feminists? That they are somehow more eligible, more qualified to speak on behalf of all women? And that was that kind of turning point in the race. So can you speak to that effect?
There are very interesting aspects in your question. I do believe first that we need men on our side, that being a feminist or working for women's empowerment, it is not working against men, it's just partnership, because we know that it is a matter of human rights, it's a matter of justice, it's a matter of economic growth, if you want, it's a matter of equilibrium, of balance in society. But at the same time, I do not believe that a feminist man is a substitute for a woman. It is not to say that I do not respect this public stand, and we all know and we admire the Prime Minister of Canada who said, I'm a feminist, Justin Trudeau, and when they asked him, why are you a feminist, why you say this? He said, because it's 21st century. And I think this is very, very important. We need such political leaders. But at the same time, this is not a surrogate, this is not a substitute for women leaders. And this is where I think the questions about women being involved in political processes, in conflict, in peace, in security, the famous resolution 1325 of the Security Council, last year we celebrated 10th anniversary of its adoption, is so important because it is not only about men deciding the fate of women and that women are just victims of conflict. Women should be at the table when issues that relate to them and also to the society, community they live in, they have to be part of this. And I think this is very important also to be emphasized in this debate.
I completely agree that women are not just victims of conflict, but they are also agents of peace, and you have stressed that often. So because of the grace and dignity that you embody, there is this false perception that your work or your campaign for Secretary General was easy, because there is this sense of ease that you brought to the whole campaign. But in reality, it was one of the most challenging times. And as Helen Clark, your rival, said, no one will pull out the red carpet for us. We have to knock down those doors, right? So on the one hand, here you are, dignified, graceful, tolerant of some of the ways in which you were portrayed, but at the same time, fiercely determined to do this on behalf of all women and on behalf of the world. So how do you, the juxtaposition of grace and dignity with the determination to knock down those doors?
Well, you know, in such races, I think what is very important is to be true to yourself, not to pretend to be somebody else. And I think in politics, sometimes women are accused of not being tough, and people say that, oh, a woman should be really very tough and very strong. And I think you may be strong and tough, not shouting or not making, you know, noises. My campaign was to show what I have done through UNESCO, the organization that I was leading, and it's not an easy job because it's the biggest organization in terms of the scope of its action. We had difficult times, quite difficult times, and I had to manage a complicated political situation, financial situation and others, and I thought that through this I have shown what I can do. But I think what was very important is, of course, to show respect to the others, and I would like to say that Helen was a competitor, not a rival. She was a friend, and she stays as a friend, and Antonio Guterres equally, and some of the other candidates. It was not fighting each other, and I understand elections for such as presenting ideas, presenting experiences, presenting vision, values, and this is what I try to do. Now, I may not have been chosen, but I think that what we started at the beginning of this conversation, I think that women now consider that this can be done, it can be reached. I'm sure that many more women will be launched into this campaign, and I would encourage in every single instance, local, national, international, women should run. Women should run for offices. I think this is very important.
Well, you certainly normalized women's leadership, and you normalized women running for office. So, but there were those moments in Helen Clark's movie where she showed how despite her role as one of the most powerful women in the world, she also had serious, rigorous caregiving duties. She was taking care of her 90-year-old father, making sure that there were these 90 meals that she was stocking in his freezer. You similarly balanced your family obligations, and that comes through in your whole journey as a leader, both in Bulgaria, at UNESCO, at the United Nations. There were times when you were a single mother, and meeting your daughter Naya has been one of the most magical moments for me, because I saw the way in which she sees the role of a powerful woman who is also a mother. And I think that's a very important aspect of all women who run for office. Whether we are mothers or not, we do have family obligations. We have caregiving obligations, whether it is to a parent, a child, or to a loved one. So how did you balance that? How did you reconcile these competing obligations?
Well, it's always a choice with women, or rather it's always a complex issue, because we women will never, of course, give up this, I would say, feeling an inner responsibility that we feel. But there is nothing better in life than listening to your daughter or a son to say, "Mama, I'm proud of you." And I think this is one of the best things that I have listened and heard in my life. I think this is very important, and also I believe that when you have a close link to your children, when you can transmit to them the same values that you share, it is also part of your life accomplishment. It is giving something to a family, to a society, to the people. So I could very easily understand Helen with her father, and when I was watching the documentary, it was so touching to see her father and her, and I have discussed this with her also. So we are human beings. We are also women like any other women in this world that have families. We want to have this intergenerational transmission of values and approach, and I think this is important. This should not be put aside.
So tell us a little bit about what I think is one of the crowning achievements of your tenure as Director-General of UNESCO. When you introduced UN Security Council Resolution 2347 before the Security Council, we've talked about this before for long. UNESCO's work was seen as very much in the realm of soft power, culture, education, women's leadership, technology. But what you did was to reimagine soft power in the guise of hard power, because you took culture to the Security Council and you said destruction of culture is a crime against humanity, and that changed history. So tell us a little bit about that moment and what led up to that moment.
Well, Rangita, I think something different is happening in the world, and of course something terrible, a huge tragedy happened and happens in the world when we see extremist views of the world. I wouldn't call it ideologies because they're not very structured, but when we saw extremists going to Mali and destroying mausoleums and mosques and temples, burning manuscripts that have kept the wisdom of Islamic culture and philosophy and medicine for thousands of years, or when you saw Palmyra and other monuments that are the birthplace of humanity being destroyed by extremists deliberately with the intention to hurt us, to try to destroy the identity of the people, and what is most important, to destroy the very feeling and vision that we can all unite as a human community around certain values. I think this is the moment where I said we have to stop this. and we have to give response. And this is not an innocent thing. This is not somebody destroying just a nice building, bricks and stones. Heritage is not about only bricks and stones. Heritage is about us, people, identity. And for me, it was very important to put this link, these dots between people, heritage, history, security, and peace. And I was really overwhelmed when the Security Council adopted this resolution, so important, we call it historic resolution, where it put a very close link between protection of heritage, peace and security. And of course, all the other relevant elements like trafficking, looting of antiquities, profiting from these illegal activities. And when I started working, I remember the day when I called Fatou Bensouda, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And I said, can we do something? In the Rome Statute, it's written that deliberate destruction of heritage is crime. And if it's a crime, we have to do something. So we started working together. We provided expertise, we provided a lot of documents to prove that what has been destroyed in Mali, it's a criminal activity. And at the end of the day, she came with this conclusion, she presented it to the International Criminal Court, and 2 years later, we had the first convicted criminal of this crime. And it may be probably not the most important of those networks of criminals, but I think it gave a very strong message, passed a message that this is not right. It's a crime. If it's a crime, it has to be punished with all the force of law. So putting the dots together, as you said, between peace, security, between protection of heritage, protecting the cultural diversity of this world is vital in this world of globalization with so many challenges that we have.
So it definitely is part of your living legacy. It is an important part, and that is something that future generations to come will owe you a debt of gratitude for. You've also said that you see the 2030 agenda or the Sustainable Development Goals as a young teenage girl, because you see the importance of this to the youth, the importance of this to young women, and the ways in which you manage to again infiltrate, and I use the word infiltrate in a very deliberate way, this development agenda and include culture as part of this historic commitment by the world governments was also a very important moment. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Agenda for Sustainable Development 2030 adopted by the United Nations is a unique document. It's very ambitious, it's universal, and I know some say, oh, can we achieve all these goals? But it's a historic moment when all humanity is aligning around certain objectives. Now, when we speak about this agenda, you mentioned that indeed I have said on several occasions that what might be the face of this Agenda 2030? And I was thinking this indeed might be a face of a girl, an adolescent girl, 10, 12 years old girl, which goes to school. She goes to a safe school. She doesn't go to fetch water or to do just the household and work in agriculture. She's going to this safe school. She's not married off at this young age. She continues. She wants to be whatever she wants to become, and she's supported by her family, by her community, and by all the enabling environment. And I think this embodies what we want to achieve in this Agenda 2030. And I have been in many places where I have been advocating for girls' education. I have been in Chad, and I remember 7 years ago I spoke with the president and I said, please, Mr. President, do something more for girls to go to school. She said, yes, but help me solve the problem with the water, because I have a severe problem with the water. Or when I went to Nepal, where girls' teenage pregnancies are very high, and they said, yes, but these girls are ignorant and families are ignorant. So I said, we have to introduce into schools also education. We have to educate them on all these important issues about reproductive health and rights and all this. So I do believe that I would say the objective is an immense and our responsibility is immense, but we know where we want to go and we have to go there. And of course, speaking once again about introducing culture to the Sustainable Development Agenda, I think it is critical if we look at all the dimensions of human development. And this is an agenda for the people, by the people, this is the idea. And without recognizing culture, identities, respect for this diversity on one side, and on the other side, recognizing in a very democratic way the role of culture, the creativity culture brings to societies, the inclusion it brings also to society, and the cohesion, I think it's vital. And I could give once again an example with the conflict and culture. When extremists destroyed the mausoleums and the mosques in Timbuktu in Mali, and I went there with the French president just a week after extremists were pushed away. And we saw the destroyed mausoleums and mosques which were attacked, and the local people were in a distress. These were monuments and living, I would say, heritage for them that stayed for more than 1,000 years. And all of a sudden somebody comes and destroys. And I promised to rebuild. We did it with the local people, with local materials. 2 years later, I went to open, to launch, to give them back. And I had the feeling that I'm giving back their identity. They couldn't imagine for them to have reconciliation after this conflict without having this heritage rebuilt.
So on that note, I want to ask you a question that has been concerning me. Last year when I spoke at Wellesley College, I dedicated my talk to you. It was a month after you had passed Security Council Resolution 2347, and in my dedication I mentioned your monumental work, but I also asked that building on 2347, that we look at attacks on girls' education as a tactic of terror, and how strengthening girls' education can be an important tool of preventing violent extremism. Because as you know, around the world there is a war against girls' education. So do you see the possibility of a resolution that could define the war against girls' education, the threats and the attacks against girls' education from Boko Haram to Afghanistan as a crime against humanity, and therefore a reason for a new Security Council resolution which defines it as such?
I think this is a very interesting idea because it can build on the Resolution 1325 for women in peace and security in conflict, and also because I think that attacks on education in such circumstances are increasing. And it is not by chance that more than 200 schools were destroyed only in the Swat Valley in Pakistan. And I remember when I was talking to Malala, this brave Pakistani girl, and I remember when I went, she invited me to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in Oslo when she was given, and Kailash Satyarthi, another great champion for children's rights, the Indian campaigner, were receiving, and she made a passionate speech about girls' education, and I think she said something very important. She said, I do not feel myself as a hero. I'm just a stubborn girl that considers and believes that every boy and girl should go to school. So when we see these increasing attacks, Boko Haram, around the Lake Chad, we see in Nigeria, in Cameroon, in Chad, we see what happens in other parts of the world also. The idea that this is not something that is isolated from peace and security is a very powerful idea. So I think as a continuation of Resolution 1325, one might think of making a step forward and speaking about girls' education in such circumstances.
And to some extent, it is about strengthening your legacy, because your legacy has been girls' education and making sure that we protect girls' education as a fundamental right, and that attacks on girls' education can be considered a threat against humanity is, I think, very important, and is a crime against humanity. So with that, I want to go back to the way I started. I said that what were your words to the girls, to the young girls who are listening to you? And to those young girls, I want to echo the words of Marian Wright Edelman. Marian Wright Edelman was Secretary Clinton's mentor, and she once told President Reagan, asking him, requesting him to appoint more women into positions of power, she said, "Women cannot be if women cannot see." So the whole idea of inviting you to speak with us is that women, young women, and those little girls who are watching these videos can be inspired to be. Because they see Irina Bokova, they will aspire to be her. And there might be a young woman in the audience who will follow in the trail that Irina Bokova blazed for all women of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rangita.